Is your dad a criminal?
Is your dad a criminal? I mean, yes, I don't say he's a criminal because he smuggled marijuana. I am pro legalization. I am now sober for a number of years. I personally haven't smoked marijuana in almost 16 years. So I don't think my dad was a criminal in that sense. And my dad actually chose not to smuggle cocaine. He chose not to smuggle heroin. Actually, cocaine was the drug that brought my dad down because of his own personal use, but he never smuggled it. And he could have made a lot more money. He chose not to do that, from an ethical standpoint. So I don't think he was a criminal in the sense of what he was bringing in. I do think he was a criminal in the fact that my dad's favorite, I don't think my dad actually cared about the power or the money or the weed or the coke as much as what he really loved, what juiced him up, was getting away with it.
Mm.
And my dad loved breaking the law, but what he really loved was getting away with breaking the law. And really, when he got back into the smuggling business, there were so many different opportunities for him to, he had good friends all over the country that had grown up and had normal jobs and offered him plenty of opportunities to go straight in really good conditions, and he refused it. And I don't think it was that he thought he was going to be a millionaire smuggling weed at 63. I think it's just he loved the juice. He loved the juice of crime.
Hello and welcome to At the Podium with me, Patrick Huey. At the Podium is a multimedia platform that brings together people from a diverse background of lives, careers, and experiences who all share one thing in common. They have stepped fully into the transformative power of finding and raising their voices to make an impact on the world we live in today. At the Podium holds a space for everyone to share their stories, to be heard, and to bring us inspiration. Today, I'm thrilled to share the podium with Kristen McGuiness. Kristen McGuiness is the best-selling author of 5150, The Magical Adventures of a Single Life. She has over 20 years experience in book publishing as an author, editor, and a book publisher. Currently, she is the founder of Rise Writers, which provides book coaching and management for emerging and established authors. In addition, she is the publisher of Rise Books, launching in 2023, which publishes fiction, nonfiction, and poetry of radical inspiration. Kristen's debut novel, Live Through This, will be published in June 2023 by Rise Books and has already received advanced praise from best-selling authors Janelle Brown and Jennifer Pasteloff. She recently published a profile on her father, one of the largest marijuana smugglers in the 1970s, for Rolling Stone magazine. And she has written and produced multiple film and TV projects and one, as she calls it, very weird play. Kristen has written for numerous publications, including Rolling Stone, Marie Claire, Huffington Post, Salon, and The Fix. She received her bachelor's degree from Hamilton College and a master's degree from the American University of Paris. Kristen lives in Ojai, California, with her husband, 2 children, and a dog named Peter. Okay, Kristen, welcome to At the Podium.
Oh, so good to see you, Patrick, as always.
I am so happy to have you here. Now, I actually want to talk about 5150 because I was reading it. I was reading through some of it last night, and I was like, hey, how did you have the stamina to do 5150? At one point, you were talking to your friend Ivan, and you were like, I'm confused on who these guys are that I'm supposed to be going on these dates with, which made me crack up. Because I was like, I was reading, I was like, oh my God, I'm so tired. How do you keep up with all these people? And then I was like, I wonder what Kristen would say, because you're happily married now. You have kids, a whole different life from where you were back when you wrote that book.
Yeah.
I was like, I wonder what Kristen would say that she learned about herself in that process of the 5150. I think you're right. God laughs at our timing. Did you write that?
Yeah. I mean, it's so funny, it's funny to talk about that book because it's such a different version of my life that like just obviously doesn't exist anymore. I'm not in the dating world. I've been married for 10 years. So it's, it's very removed from I mean, I think I'm the same person, right? But it's very removed from who I am in terms of the mechanics of my life. But yeah, the stamina piece, I mean, writing a book really helped. So and as I say at the beginning of the book, I had been single for a really long time at that point, and I had been a struggling writer for a really long time at that point. So I was sort of like a struggling romantic and a struggling writer. And I was like, two birds, one stone. I'll write a book about going on a date a week for a year. And, either I'll have a book or a boyfriend by the end of it, And so sometimes when I wasn't so much interested in getting the boyfriend, I was interested in getting the book. And so I just kept, and I had a rule, which was great as a writer. I had a rule that I couldn't go on the next date until I'd written the chapter of the date before. So it really kept my writing practice up because I was having to just like write. I would like have to write, like literally I'd be going on a date and I'd be like, I've got to finish the chapter from the date before, So like I'm gonna be 30 minutes late. But it also kept the dating up because I was trying to get the book done. And then, I think that once I got into it, I mean, I certainly had a lot of fun doing it. I mean, there were points where because there were points where there were moments of like, oh, I might have met someone, right? And then when that didn't work out, I would get disappointed. And it was really hard to be like, all right, I got to get back into the game. I'm doing this thing. But I will say that the other side of it is that the book isn't just dates with random dudes off the internet. A few months in, I had a wonderful boss at that time. I was working in a nonprofit and I was working for the CEO of the organization. And I had in the book, I date this guy very briefly. We call him Jimmy Voltage in the book. And he kind of breaks my heart in 3 weeks, as one of those like fast, like he takes me to Thanksgiving dinner with his family and then the next week breaks up with me. And so she saw I was just down and out and she said, I want to introduce you to someone. And I thought she was going to set me up on a date. And it ended up being with a woman who was both a healer in shamanic practice and also a licensed therapist. So, and I think I call her Lydia in the book. Her real name is Alyssa, but and Alyssa and I began to do work and I realized that those were dates too, right? And at some point, somebody actually who was like a funder or something at our organization said to me, so what constitutes a date in the book then if they're not just all with, people? And I said, anything that brings me closer to love. And so it really opened up that, I went on dates with my family members. I go on dates with some of my friends. And really it's anything that brings me closer to love. So thankfully that reduced the number of actual dates I had to go on for the book. So I think I forget now. It was like 24 non-random dude dates and it ends up being like 37 dude dates. But I identify as straight and all the dates were with dudes in the book. So they weren't with my friends. So
your dad, Dan McGuiness, is a huge figure in your life and really in the world, even though people may not know that. They will after they read the Rolling Stone article. But you write of your dad, Dan McGuiness, in 5150, and I'm going to read it. To some, he might just have been a big talking con, barking orders while coke fell out of his nose. But to me, he was the king of diamonds, my ace of spades. And later, when I too became a big talking con, barking orders while coke fell out of my nose, I thought I might actually be him. I would desperately try to feel him in me, even when he was far away. I would look for him in the lines of blow, in the shots of whiskey, in the loose memories I had of him all before I was 5. And then I think about your description of your longing for your dad in relation to the article that you wrote in Rolling Stone, which was called Learjets, Mistresses, and Bales of Weed, My Dad's Life as a Drug Kingpin. And even in that, it still felt like you were trying to find him and discern who he was through a very different lens than what you wrote in 5150. How did that journey of your view of him shift from 5150 to the Rolling Stone article?
Well, I think a major piece of it was that he was still alive when I was writing 5150. And oddly enough, I didn't anticipate this, but he gets released from prison for the last time in the middle of that book. So, I mean, I started writing the book and we never knew, like he would go in, he was in for a very long sentence. So he served about 22 years straight.
Mhm.
And then he was released, but then he went back out into the business and then he was caught and he was put back in, and then he was released again. He went right back into the business. He was caught and put back in, and then he was released a third and final time. And that was in the middle of 5150. So those years like leading up to his final release were really stressful, as one can imagine, having your father go back and forth in between prison and drug smuggling. And I was in my 20s and it was very much, you know, it hadn't been a part of my life. I mean, it had always been a part of my life. My father was in prison my entire childhood. He wrote me letters every week. I usually talked to him once a week. He would always call me on the weekend, like from when I was, you know, let's say 7 years old on. So I had like a weekly phone call with him. I would always receive, I had boxes and boxes of letters in the, you know, in our garage and in our attic to this day. So we had a very close relationship, but I never saw him physically. He never wanted me to visit him in prison because he always thought he was getting out. And he lived in this like delusion that he was like always getting out. And so, and then when he did finally get out, it was just chaos. And it was really hard. So I had just, I mean, now I'm so removed from it. And actually in writing this piece, it really kind of brought a lot of those years back of like 2004 to 2009, which were the last 5 years of his life. And just how dramatic and traumatic it was for me. And I was, you know, as that passage shows, I was doing drugs and drinking myself. And I was hitting my own bottom in that same time period, and then I'm getting sober. So when I was writing that, you know, he was still alive. He was still very active in my life. And in fact, to become even more active throughout the course of that book, because it was the first time he was out. And in fact, we have dinner in LA as one of the dates in October. And not long before the book ends, he's at one of the last dates. I think he's like date number, I don't remember. It's been a really long time, but it's very much towards the end of the book. And it just kind of worked out that way. And we go out to dinner. It's very much a date, you know? And in fact, we don't know each other in that setting. We've never sat across a dinner table from each other, you know? And we have this really beautiful night, but it's just this one night, you know, and then he leaves, and that was on October 4th, and he ended up dying on February 4th. So just 4 months later. And so, you know, that was in 2009. 5150 came out in 2010. I actually started dating my now husband in 2010, just before 5150 came out. And in those last 10 years, he's really been gone. I mean, it was weird. I grieved him a lot when he died, but then there was also so much relief that, you know, and then I started building this life. You know, I stayed sober, I got married, I got careers, I wrote a book, I had children, and I live in suburban Ojai. And I mean, I don't always pay my bills on time, but other than that, I pay my bills. You know, I live a very, I mean, my husband the other day walked into our house and he goes, "Do you know we have a white picket fence?" And I said, "Yeah, Terry, like we're the ones that put it up." And he was like, "I know, but like we have a white picket fence." And I'm like, "Yeah, we do." So they don't know. But it's, you know, it's a very different life, obviously. And I think the more that I've built a conventional life, the more removed I've almost become from him emotionally. And so writing that article, writing the Rolling Stone article, has been a lot of like revisiting who this person was. And I think it has been more emotionally impactful for me than I actually anticipated, because I've been so emotionally removed from him for so long. And to begin to sort of visit him again has brought up a lot of just the reminder of how painful his life was, you know? And I think for those that were on the outside of it, you know, even now, like I recognize, like it's a really interesting story. It's a really like fun story, right? It's why we watch Narco. And in fact, one of the reasons why I began writing about it, my husband we kept watching Narcos on Netflix, and my husband would be like, "Why aren't you writing your dad's story?" You know, because I'd be like, "Oh yeah, that like I know those people, like I know that guy," and he'd be like, "What? Like, why aren't you writing this story?" So anyway, it was finally time for me to write the story. And as you know, I mean, I've been part of helping other people to write their stories. And, you know, the whole time I've been sort of sitting on this really big story myself that I guess in some ways I just wasn't really ready yet to tell. And I wasn't ready to see him again, and I
Yeah.
think now I just was in a place in my life where I was. So
It's all in the timing. Everything
yeah.
happens in its own perfect timing. I wanted to talk about, in the Rolling Stone article, you describe your dad as one of the architects of the modern drug trade, which I thought was such a profound statement about just how deep he was into
Mhm.
smuggling drugs into the US. And I was wondering perhaps if you knew what the drug trade was like prior to your dad, and how did he change it? And what remains today of what he built, and how technology has maybe impacted that.
Yeah, I mean, my dad was smuggling in my dad started smuggling in a pre-cocaine, pre-heroin time period. So, I mean, it wasn't that cocaine and heroin weren't being trafficked, but not at the amounts that they ended up being trafficked in the 70s. So he started in 1966. So it's about a good 10 years before you see some of these hard drug booms. And not that those drugs weren't coming into the country. So he was moving marijuana, which is a very different product because it's big and it's bulky. And so it's a cumbersome product to move versus cocaine and heroin, which are very, there's a difference between a kilo, which is like this big, and a bale. And so
Right.
easier to move a kilo. And you make a lot more money from it. So he really started out when it was, there were sophisticated smugglers coming out of Mexico for a long time. So it's not, back, and I had looked into this because, he sort of told me that he built the highway out of Nogales. But I think in what he did was that a lot of traffickers were used to using Tijuana as their major. So that's where everybody paid attention to, was Tijuana, because you could swim things, you could put them on a boat. They were a lot easier. You could be a fisherman with just bales,
You
right?
said it was a tire that people would put.
Yeah. So, and they still do it to this day, which is crazy. But what they would do is they take a tractor tire and they just fill a tractor tire can float. And so they will fill the inside of that with bales of weed or cocaine or whatever product. I'm sure now it's mainly benzos and narco, but they would fill it and then they swim it across because, it's a lot harder to catch a lone swimmer than it is a boat, right? Coast Guard's probably not going to see you in the middle of the night, so you don't do it during the day. But they would swim in the middle of the night from Tijuana, or like south of Tijuana. It's about a 10-mile journey up to the southern San Diego, and then it's actually, there's like the Tijuana Sloughs is where the Tijuana River empties out into the Pacific right there, and so there's kind of like a point that everybody would dump on that beach. And oddly enough, when my husband and I were first dating, so this was like April of 2010, we've been together like a month, and it was Easter Sunday. And I was so at one point I was working on this project many, many years ago. And my aunt actually asked me not to do it. Her husband was still alive at the time, and they had just been so traumatized. This is my father's sister. They've been so traumatized by his life that they just didn't want any more attention. They didn't want people knowing about it. Now, my uncle has since passed. My aunt is very old and not, doesn't really pay attention. So her kids were like, write it. So at that time, I kind of started it and then stopped. And Terry and I actually went to that beach, and we walk up on the beach and there's a giant tractor tire on the beach. I mean, just sitting there, like we were like, what? And so it is something that they still do to this day. But my father realized that that was like a really not a particularly productive or sustainable way to move product. And so they went inland, which is kind of the big thing. And that's really where he developed that major route, not so much out of Nogales, because I think there were a lot of Mexican smugglers who'd been doing that for a long time. But then he navigated that route up to, there was a small highway that wasn't really well trafficked and no one was paying attention to. And they weren't looking at white drivers on that highway, right? And so they began smuggling up through that smuggler's highway that my dad really helped to build. And then they began to build up Nogales, which is now, I mean, that is the capital of drug smuggling. It's where El Chapo's from. Like that is the like house of the Mexican cartels. And my dad and the local smugglers there were the ones that really built up that whole region as the center of Mexican smuggling and moved it out of Tijuana, which had been where it had been. So that was where my dad really kind of was the architect of that region in terms of, really creating the trafficking out of there. And then he basically went and did the same thing in Colombia. And then he basically took his model and then he moved it down to Colombia, where again, there was exporting that was happening, but he began to move stuff through Panama and was one of the first people that the government knows of who actually paid off Noriega. And this was before he was even president. He was the director of intelligence at that time. And my father began paying him to move product through Panama, which then led to the Noriega trials in the 1980s. But also made Panama later, when the cocaine smugglers came in, and this is like Pablo Escobar and all of them, they started using Panama. That's how they got stuff through. That's how they moved product through. And that channel had been laid by my dad. So that's where, no one sort of knew his name. But as I began, and that's where I didn't even really know the Colombian connection until I began working on the book proposal. And there's a former, you would never want me to call him a smuggler, a former businessman from the area, started telling me what actually had happened. And then the FBI agent, who I've known for a very long time, who worked on my father's case for a long time, is actually now a friend of mine. He was part of my dad potentially testifying against Noriega. So he knew a lot from that end as well. And so I began to really kind of piece together these pieces. And I always sort of knew about the Nogales story from my dad, but then I found out about the Colombian story. And then my uncle was the one who sort of knew the Jamaican story. And as I began to put it together, I'm like, wow, basically he created a model in the mid-60s and he just kept, copying that, replicating it. Yeah.
Is your dad a criminal?
Is your dad a criminal? I mean, yes, I don't say he's a criminal because he smuggled marijuana. I mean, I am pro legalization. I am now sober for a number of years. I personally haven't smoked marijuana in almost 16 years. So I don't think my dad was a criminal in that sense. And my dad actually chose not to smuggle cocaine. He chose not to smuggle heroin. Actually, cocaine was the drug that brought my dad down because of his own personal use, but he never smuggled it. And he could have made a lot more money. He chose not to do that, from an ethical standpoint. So I don't think he was a criminal in the sense of what he was bringing in. I do think he was a criminal in the fact that my dad's favorite, I don't think my dad actually cared about the power or the money or the weed or the coke as much as what he really loved, what juiced him up, was getting away with it. And my dad loved breaking the law, but what he really loved was getting away with breaking the law. And really, when he got back into the smuggling business, there were so many different opportunities for him to, he had good friends all over the country that had grown up and had normal jobs and offered him plenty of opportunities to go straight in really good conditions, and he refused it. And I don't think it was that he thought he was going to be a millionaire smuggling weed at 63. I think it's just he loved the juice. He loved the juice of crime. And I think, to me, that's one of the more I think you had asked, is it a pathology, right?
The pathology of that, yeah.
Yeah. And I do. I think it was. I think it's a pathological trait of getting high off of committing crime. And I think it's really an interesting thing. Like, at one point when I was working on this book many years ago, I'd actually called it Addicted to Crime, because I think it was its own addiction, that adrenaline rush, and he did it. My dad was known as Houdini in the Bureau of Prisons because of his multiple escape attempts and he has successfully escaped federal prison 3 times. One time for a year and a half, another time for 2 days, and then one time for 2 hours.
Kristen, I was reading the court indictment against your dad.
Yeah.
And at one point, there were 50 officers trying to capture him.
Yeah. Yeah.
But one thing that I found very interesting about the article, and then as I was reading all the complaints against him that are online, and it surprised me that Hoyt, the FBI person, the DA gentleman, and even his mistress, they speak about him in very fond terms. There's not this sort of moral-centered animus against him because he was smuggling thousands and thousands of bales and pounds of drugs into the U.S. There is an odd respect and fondness for him, and it was dissonant within me, because I was like, I get it. I get the whole, we love the Bonnie and Clyde, we love the Jesse James stories, but it felt weird to me in a way. I don't know if weird is the right word, but it definitely struck a very interesting chord within me. I was like, "Wow, I'm having feelings about this." But it was in every person you spoke to for that article and have interviewed, they have a really profound respect, fondness for Dan McGuiness.
No, I really realized, like, as I was doing this book, like, they're just playing the same game. And, and David said, like, it was just a job, I mean, it could have been any job. It wasn't like he wasn't there for any moral, like, drugs are bad. He was just collecting a check to catch people that were breaking the law. Like, he personally, I mean, he thinks some drugs are bad. I mean, he's not into this like complete legalization of cannabis because he spent so much time, busting people for it. But he just saw it and he liked a lot of the people, and he was like, he actually has continued to be friends with many of the smugglers that he put in prison. And which is funny, but like, it's not uncommon. And that's what I've discovered. Similarly, Richard Garcia, who's the FBI agent who my dad worked with in the 1980s, and they became like very close personal friends. And to the point where then I became close personal friends with Rich. And Rich was the same way, a lot of it, because it's this very similar personality type. The cops and the robbers are the same kids on the street, and at the end of the game, they're still friends. And so I think that's why David had a lot of respect for my dad. He respected that my dad always got away with it. I mean, it was kind of like, it's kind of like being on the opposing team, but it's not like you aren't impressed by the 3-pointer that LeBron makes, right? Like you might have lost the game, but you're still like, damn, that was a good game he played. And I think that's how they felt, like you might be on an opposing team, but you're still impressed when LeBron, kills it on the court. And so like my dad killed it on the court for a long time. And I think Hoyt came to respect that. And he was very sad that he never got to meet him. So that's actually, David Hoyt found me, oddly enough. I was working on this book proposal and I was just doing interviews and I thought his name was Dennis Hoyt. And I kept Googling a Dennis Hoyt DEA and nothing was coming up. And out of nowhere, I get this email from a David Hoyt. And he said, and it's like, subject, your father. And he was like, hi, Kristen, I was watching this, he was watching some local news and there was a woman on it who had my mother's name and he thought it might have been my mom. And then he Googled my father and found out he had passed away. And then he found me. And, he said in that first conversation, I was just so sad to hear your dad had died. I had always hoped to meet him, And so, yeah, I've discovered it's been a really it's an interesting part of what I've learned in the work is just how much these guys actually have no animosity against each other.
In the first season of the show, we had a gentleman on whose name was Quentin Venny, who had a serious drug trade between Baltimore, Maryland, and New York City. He's since reformed his life. He works with Gwyneth Paltrow. It's a whole turnaround. Do you know Quentin?
I know Quentin.
You know Quentin.
Yeah.
The world is so small.
Yeah.
And we talked about, he feels a lot of remorse about what he did. And in reading the article about your dad, I didn't get a sense that he ever expressed to you a sense of remorse for the lives he may have impacted. Did he ever do that, or as far as you know, have any sort of reckoning within himself about what he did?
No, my father had no remorse. And he, and I understand to a certain extent why. I mean, he felt that his sentence was a horrific injustice, and it was. I mean, there was no doubt. I mean, my dad initially had a 60-year sentence with a special 2-year parole attached at the end. And so it was gnarly, and it was really the only, and I mean, look, he got it because he got it because he escaped from federal prison and they were really mad at him. So by the time my father escaped between being indicted or found guilty and then before his sentencing, so by the time they brought him back in for sentencing, he had been on the lam for over 2 years. And they, and some people do not like my dad. I mean, I will say that for all the David Hoyts there in the world, I at one point was in Tallahassee for one of my dad's sentencings. I was at the hearing. And when I walked in and went through security, the guard saw my ID and he goes, Kristen McGuiness. And I said, yeah. And he goes, you're not related to Dan McGuiness, are you? And I said, he's my father. And he goes, too bad for you. And so there were certainly people that despised him, but I think that my dad really just looked at that all of it was a miscarriage of justice. He also felt like cannabis should have always been legal. And the last time I actually ever talked to my dad, I was at the Obama inauguration in 2008. Suddenly my phone rings and I'm like standing on an empty mall in front of the Capitol building, like right after the Obama inauguration. It's my dad. And he was like, we did it, Kay. Like we did it, because he believed that Obama was going to federally legislate marijuana legalization. He really believed that if anybody would do that, it would be Barack Obama, who actually didn't do it at all. But my dad had hopes of that. And that was really like his final wish, was to see weed legalized, which would have, you know, I mean, not that he couldn't have been into cannabis growing, but effectively would have put him out of business for what he did, but he didn't care. You know, he really believed that, you know, he called it the green, you know, and he really believed that the green didn't deserve a criminal sentence. So I know he missed me, but he never really took responsibility for it. I grew up learning to blame a justice system, which I still do. You know, I mean, I can see now where he was responsible, but I also recognize that it was a miscarriage of justice, and also that it should never have been illegal in the first place.
So, Kristen, when you write this book, as you're writing this book, what are we supposed to take from the book?
From American Narco, well, the book proposal for the book is called American Narco. I really think it's about coming to terms with who our parents are. You know, one of my last lines in the like sample chapter is that, you know, it's really about recognizing the love we have for our parents, no matter who they are or what they might have done, you know, and how much that love means to us. Even when, you know, I mean, when I was a child, I was so in love with him. I mean, he was the, you know, as you shared from the book, right? He really was that like ace of spades. He was everything to me. And as I got older, I became really disillusioned with those choices. And as, again, my life became more conventional, I really emotionally moved away from him. And I think that I've had to sort of re-embrace the love I had for him, because I see it in my own children, you know, and I see just how much they love us. You know, I think that's the one thing you don't anticipate when you become a parent, because by the time you're a parent, the love for your own parents has changed a lot. You know, it's become more complicated. It's not just that like fire hose of love that you just spray at a human being all day long. And when you have kids, that's basically what it is. They just spray this fire hydrant of, not that they can't be annoying, they don't throw fits and they slam doors in your face, but you just know it. Their love for you is so sweet and deep. And I realized that was the love I had for him, you know, even though he wasn't even there. And I think, you know, coming to terms with that piece, both emotionally, but also seeing it as, you know, I can't help but not see the politics of it too, of that this is what happens when we take daddies away, you know, and mommies too. And the implications that has in families. And really, you know, as I say, this book is very much about the quote crimes, but it's also about the men who were determined to bring them down. And I will say, I like David Hoyt a lot. I love Rich Garcia. He's actually been a wonderful help to us as a family at different points when my father was alive and afterwards. But I also see that, like, because it, you know, in a way it hurts me though when they say it was just a job. And it's like, did you not ever recognize what your job did? You know, like, I recognize it's just a job. You know, we all have to have a job, right? But like, to not be able to think about the ramifications of the choices you make in that job and what that job actually does to the families on the other side, right? Because at the end of the day, yeah, that man goes away to prison, but there's a whole group of people who get left behind in the mix. And so I do think it's, you know, it's about that personal story of loving a daddy who isn't there and having to come to terms with that love as an adult. But it's also a political story about how our system, you know, and I'm a rare breed, right? I mean, when I would go to prison to go visit my dad, most of the people in the visiting room didn't look like me, right? I grew up pretty upper middle class white girl in suburban Dallas, going to private school and private college and all of that. And my mom kicked butt, but but I also know but I also know how much it impacts, obviously, families of color, and it's egregious, and they lose the daddies they love too. So
Do you think that your dad is an empathetic figure?
in some ways, but I think he's more complicated than that. I mean, I think what he did is not, to me, a moral question. I mean, it was really just a business decision. He smuggled drugs, but I think and I think he's a swashbuckler, right? So there's an element of empathy in anybody who's that kind of heroic, I mean, he was always willing. And I will also say he never ratted people out. He had a very strong ethos. So I think he's empathetic in those ways. He had a lot of integrity in the work that he did. I also think, though, as a father, like, he never got it, and I think he's less empathetic when you actually see how he shows up in his personal relationships. I think that to a certain extent, he was a narcissistic sociopath. I mean, he was able to disconnect. I mean, when you ask, was he remorseful? It's one thing to say, like, what I did I shouldn't have been arrested for, but I'm also really sorry that it impacted your life so much. And he was never able to see that, and in fact, Susan, his mistress, who was really his girlfriend. I mean, for a long time, I grew up calling her mistress because that's how my mother viewed her. But now I actually see, like, my mom and my dad had the weirdest relationship. My mother, like, won't steal pens from the office. Like, she's so, my mom is like the biggest rule follower, like, just type A personality. Everything has to fit in its order. I just, she could absolutely be a cop. Like, she is so talking about cops and robbers. She was the cop. Where Susan was a swashbuckler. Susan Greenberg was a swashbuckler, like my dad, and they really connected. And so, she says, like, even when she knew that my life was more challenging and she had read some things and knew stuff about me, and she would say, are you worried about Kristen? And he was like, oh no, she's fine. She's great. Like, he could not see where the choices he had made had created implications in my own life. And he couldn't even be sorry for it, So I think that there are parts of him that you can't help but judge that those emotional choices, even while you might support some of his other ones.
I mean, it's a complex story. We're all complex people, and
absolutely,
we can't sit in judgment of people. That's not what we're here to do.
Yeah.
Is this experience what led you into the writing?
So, I mean, maybe I grew up, my father went away to prison when I was 3, and I was raised by my mom and my grandmother in a very, I mean, my family's response to the years of mayhem was like, batter down, like, shut the doors. I mean, not that we weren't weird, but like a little bit. Like, I lived in a little condo with my mom and my grandmother. I shared a bedroom with my mom. My mom worked all the time. Hence, that's how I got to go to private school. And, she just, like, she threw herself into taking care of our family. My grandmother basically played my mom. And my grandmother was an avid reader. So I will say I got that from, but I was, my mom says, like, when I was a little kid, I would just have her read me book after book. She'd be dying, and I'd be like, another one. And she'd be like, no, my kids are not like that. I have to be like, I'm going to read you a book. But I loved books and I loved reading. And so I was that kid that would rip through a book in a day. And by the time I was in 3rd grade, like, I was reading, like, way above, like, I was reading Catcher in the Rye in 3rd grade. And I was reading Danielle Steele novels in 3rd grade. And I would read a Danielle Steele novel in one day. And, like, when I was 9 years old, I could rip through 600 pages in a day. And I was a voracious, like, if I exceeded in anything, it was reading. So I can't imagine, if you like to read that much, that you aren't a little tempted to see what it might be like to write. And so, I mean, from 2nd grade, I think I was already telling people I was going to be a writer when I grew up. And I don't know, I mean, I think the dynamics of our life, it was a great place for me to escape, obviously. It was a stressful childhood in the sense that, like, my parents had just been horribly traumatized, my mom and grandma, and they were just trying to put the pieces back together. And we were very keep calm and carry on. And so I just, I read and I started writing, and that became definitely, I worked in bookstores, then I worked in book publishing, then I wrote my own book, then I started ghostwriting books, then I began book coaching, kind of got back into book editing, and then I began to get into book publishing. So, I mean, I say, like, there's no doubt it's funny because I work so much in books, I actually don't get to read books at all anymore. So like, I haven't probably read a book in 5 years. It's so bad. I'm like, one day I'm going to read books again. But I was just telling somebody this morning, I was like, I hope to live until 90. I think that's because I just turned 45. So I was like, I'd like to live until, if I had my druthers, my grandmother's 90 now. So I think it's in the blood, but if I could live until 90, that would be great. And then I will just spend from 80 to 90 reading books. And that's where I'll catch up on all the time I lost. And I'll read like 3 books a day for 10 years.
Kristen, you have launched your own publishing company. And I wonder, whose voices do you want to amplify through your own publishing house?
So yeah, just like last week, I announced the launch of Rise Books. And the beauty of Rise is that we're publishing fiction, nonfiction, and also books of poetry that are all of radical inspiration. And so and it's interesting because I was for a while, I was really trying to figure out, like, what is the thread? What is that thing that we're looking to publish? And it really is radical inspiration. It's this idea of how do we get inspired to radical action, both political and personal. And I think, as I've said in the book, I'm both a deeply, I don't think you can grow up with such an enormous amount of injustice in your life, or at least, I certainly felt injustice from a systemic level, right? I saw a system take somebody I love away for 20 years and remove him from society. And you can't grow up and say there's something wrong with the system, and that I want to be part of changing that system. And that is, I wake up every day with that on my breath. My husband and I, that's what we came together over as people, that we were so committed to that the politics is personal. Sometimes he's a little more political than I, and I'm like, okay, enough. But because he's real political, that's all he talks about. But I share in that ethos, and so I really wanted to write books that aren't political in nature; they're personal in nature, but they're really about how do we create systemic change through the stories we tell, the lives we lead, and the impact we have on other people. And those are the voices that I hope to amplify.
Kristen, this season of the show, we're talking to people who are in search of their voice, whether that's the pen or the spoken voice or a singing voice. And I wonder what you would want to say to the world with your platform today.
I think, to me, like, if there was any space in the platform, I really do believe that. I think it's about looking back towards the past, to our parents, to our ancestries, to our own histories and our personal stories. And then how do we mine that territory in order to make changes and live better lives? And I think, the great MLK quote, right? The arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. But I actually think it's too long, and we have to break the arc because we don't have that much time anymore. And we have to do something differently as people, globally, locally. And, we all have our way into that. And mine is storytelling. And I just think that is the power of our stories. So that's why I'm here to tell mine and here to help other people tell theirs.
Kristen, thank you so much for your time today and your wisdom. And to those of you who are watching or listening, remember, we all have a voice. Use yours wisely. Bye, everyone. And thank you, Kristen.
Thank you.